Whoever left this up here, thank you. All right, thanks everyone for coming back from lunch. My name is Erin, and today I'll be presenting on honoring ambivalence in incarcerated women transitioning into a prostitution diversion program. Before I move forward, I want to say that all artwork in this presentation is created by an artist named Paula Bonnet, unless noted otherwise. All right. To orient us to the presentation, I'll be going over these today. I'll let you look at them so I can save myself some time. All right. Although the US accounts for only 4.4% of the world's population, it houses 22% of the world's prisoners, leaving us with the highest rate of incarceration in the world, according to Wamsley. With the obliteration of psychiatric institutions during the Reagan administration, our jails and prisons were left to house a vast amount of individuals with mental illness in our country. Due to an increase in drug laws and harsh mandatory minimums, the war on drugs was monumental in our nation's rapid increase in incarcerated population since the 1980s. Arguably, our jails and prisons have become our nation's new mental institutions. According to Belknap et al., during a recent 15-year period, there was nearly a 50% increase of women in jail, of which Young et al. Estimates 84% are nonviolent offenders. I want to give you a brief introduction to one such woman before we move into the introduction to my internship site and the review of the literature. That way we can hold her in mind as we begin to dissect the systemic problem. All right. Caroline, pseudonym used to maintain confidentiality, was apprehended for her second prostitution charge at the time I met her. This is right after being released from her first one. She has 3 sons, all from separate fathers. Oops. 2 of them were removed from her custody by their fathers, and her youngest was removed from the Department of Human Services. Caroline is a petite white woman in her early 40s who states she rarely faced consequences for her actions during her youth. She's the youngest child of 2, whom reported physical and sexual abuse in childhood and adulthood, experiencing domestic violence from 4 of her partners. Caroline is very close to her mother and lived with her mom during her adult life. Caroline made no mention of her relationship with her father or stepfather, despite disclosing sexual abuse in childhood. She began street-based prostitution and substance abuse in her late 30s after being unable to find employment. Caroline's husband died within the past few years. He passed while she was smoking crack cocaine outside of the hospital. Her niece and nephew were murdered while she was incarcerated, and her youngest son attempted suicide around the time of her arrest. For PTSD, Caroline scored with extreme impairment in the domains of intrusion and avoidance symptoms and negative alterations in thoughts and moods. During my 9-month internship, I worked at an adult outpatient agency on the Front Range of Colorado. It operated primarily under feminist and trauma-informed models of treatment, and it serviced women in the criminal justice system, women with HIV or AIDS, women with mental health diagnoses and addictions, and also they had significant trauma histories. Of particular interest is the unique settings in which Caroline and I engaged in art therapy. Materials were restricted to chalk and oil pastels during individual sessions while incarcerated. They had to be counted each time before she left. Whether people walked in the room while we were in session or our conversations being heard down the hall, in both locations, confidentiality was an illusion. Given the introduction material, my research question was informed by the need for social justice reform in the criminal justice system and institutions of incarceration. The study attempts to investigate the use of art therapy as a tool to demonstrate progress in treatment-resistant women involved in the criminal justice system. Given the impact of trauma on the verbalization of emotion and cognitive processes, and art therapy's unique ability to bypass these deficits, it's hypothesized that art therapy is an effective treatment approach to address cognitive and emotional patterns impacting recidivism in justice-involved women. The next image may be a little bit jarring, though it was intentionally chosen, as oftentimes women in this profession are pressed to the background of our consciousness, or the surface of their behavior is superficially ridiculed instead of recognizing the violence that they encounter on a daily basis. According to the diathesis stress model, instances of childhood and/or sexual victimization qualify as factors that contribute to the development of mental health problems. Dalla et al. Found 74% of women engaged in prostitution report a history of childhood sexual abuse. It's difficult to gauge the percentage of women engaged in or incarcerated for prostitution due to its clandestine nature and a variety of alternative charges given at the time of arrest. For example, disorderly conduct, vagrancy, suspicion, public disorder, local ordinance, or drug-related offenses. Though it's reported that many incarcerated women, regardless of charges, have histories of exchanging sex for items of value, and this is consistent with what I experienced at my internship site. For example, Alvarez et al. And Rowan, Sepowitz, and Ward estimate between 75 and 90% of women engaged in prostitution use illegal drugs. Crack cocaine has a specific link to women engaged in street-based prostitution, and according to Ditmore, it serves as a physical and emotional coping mechanism in a highly stressful, abusive, and physically intrusive profession. For example, Alvarez et al. Found 82% of women engaged in prostitution were physically assaulted while working. 73% were raped while working, and 78% were threatened with a weapon while working. This makes street-based prostitution having the highest rate of mortality out of any profession, placing women 18 times more likely to die than you and I in this room. In an international study, PTSD in women involved in prostitution was statistically higher in severity than that found in war veterans and women with histories of physical and/or sexual abuse, according to Alvarez et al. I just want that to sink in for a little minute, because these populations listed on the bottom of the screen are traditionally recognized and studied for PTSD treatment. A newer body of research has found relational and creative therapies to uniquely support the recovery of women who are incarcerated. Examples such as helping women recover and beyond trauma illustrate this success in correctional environments, according to Bloom and Covington. This gender-responsive treatment is the basis of my theoretical orientations. According to Balby, individuals seek safety through trustworthy relationships when feeling threatened. And Ainsworth et al. Found this safety-seeking behavior becomes compromised when the quality of caregiver interactions during early life is harsh, neglectful, or inconsistent, just to name a few. According to Judith Herman, it's through relationships that we acquire the wounds that hurt us, and therefore it's only through relationship that one can be healed. The importance of attachment and addiction's relationship to trauma is that we're finding substances are being used as a coping mechanism for severed attachment systems. What we find is that an individual forms a secure base with the substance instead of people once relationships have become too painful. Given the need for evidence-based practices to secure grant funding in partnership with institutions of incarceration, I decided to utilize a neurobiological framework in explaining the efficacy of art therapy with this population. According to research conducted by both Rolls and Siegel and Solomon, there's a direct relationship between the site of a traumatic event, trauma recall, emotion processing, and the visual learning system that encodes responses to a traumatic event. According to the American Psychological Association, flashbacks, dreams, and memories are diagnostic intrusion symptoms of PTSD. And what are all of these? They're types of images. Malchiotti and Damasio assert that the body responds to these very images, whether they're real or imagined, as if the trauma is presently real. The visual intrusion symptoms of PTSD, in addition to other diagnostic criteria, such as affect dysregulation and alterations in cognitions, make expressing distressing experiences problematic. Image making, therefore, has a direct link to affect regulation, emotionally motivated behavior, altering associations to traumatic memory, and the construction of new narratives. As you can see in the chart up here, these therapeutic gains align precisely with common symptoms of trauma, specifically symptoms found within Caroline. Okay. These are the methods that I used with my time with Caroline. I'll explain them a little bit more in depth during the actual case study. At this point, I'll move into a brief synopsis of Caroline's body, speech, mind. Developed by Rabin and Walker, body, speech, mind is a descriptive technique that incorporates mindfulness for clinicians to present about clinical work in a precise, non-judgmental fashion. The usefulness of this approach is to remove one's preconceptions and bias of a client, as well as any motivations the clinician may have to prove themselves superior in their treatment or diagnosis of a case, in order to see the client more clearly as a whole person. If Caroline were an animal, she would be a mouse jetting quickly across the room before ever having an opportunity to catch her in your hands. If that event were to arise, she would intensely wiggle and squirm to pop out of your grip in a heartbeat and dart off to the corner in a flash. Her presence is immediately noticed, but it's rare to catch her in a moment of calm. Body. Caroline is a slim and petite white woman in her early 40s whose height, weight, squirmy energy, and taut skin caused me to think she was at least 10 years younger. Her wiry red hair unkemptly framed her face, which contrasted her large darting eyes, upturned nose, and hollow cheeks. Caroline's clothes were identical to her peers, with her wide striped pants and shirt set devouring her body and her neon sneakers barely touching the floor. Speech. Much like Caroline's flighty mannerisms, her speech was rapid. She talked with a slight accent. Perhaps from years on the street, she learned how to throw words softly to emphasize the intensity of her meaning. She bookended the content of her communication with repetitive and alternating fillers that muddied together when speaking. I feel thankful for these muddied rhythm markers so I can adjust the speed at which I listen before missing a point. She leads with facts and memories with ease, though rarely speaks first about her affective world. Mind. Caroline's mind was full of anxiety and perseverated on fearful details as if it grounded her to this physical plane. When struck by a painful memory, it ran fiercely from her mouth untamed. The storm passed just as quickly as it came. Her thoughts often recounted the future or the past, but not her present moment. The Diagnostic Drawing Series is a standardized 3-drawing timed assessment in which a client is given 3 specific prompts followed by a set of structured questions. Each image exemplifies how a person responds to both structure and specific directives. It also evokes different themes according to Cohen, Hammer, and Singer. In the first image of the Diagnostic Drawing Series, the client is asked to make a picture using these materials. As you can see, Caroline only used lines to create her image. Nothing's filled in. There's a heavily embellished roof on the house with a chimney extruding a steady stream of smoke. There are 3 large people outside and 3 small people inside the home. Caroline noted that there was no doorknob on the door, stating that her children couldn't get inside and would have to stay outside and be happy. She said the house represented a foundation instead of worry, and that inside she lived with her mom and her boyfriend. Caroline was very engaged in creating this image as she sat with a foot folded under her, leaned forward, and audibly exhaled at the completion of a line. She was visibly startled, jumping in her seat after a door slammed in a room behind her. She was rapid in her creation of the image, finishing in 1 to 2 minutes. Also, she was the quietest I have ever seen her. In the second image of the DDS, the client is asked to draw a picture of a tree. Again, Caroline only used outlines. And there's no detail in the image, just a green circular top and a brown base, similar to the shape of a keyhole. Caroline stated her tree was blowing in the wind, and that it was a good thing her kids didn't depend on her to draw. She also described excessive detail not present in the image, things such as flowers and the tree, grass, and roots, of which she stated her least favorite part of the image was the roots, because eventually they will die. Caroline was tentative in creating this image. Her hand hesitated before quickly putting lines on the page, completing the picture in roughly a minute or less. She visibly disliked the image, saying, "Nah," and with a shrug of the shoulders, and moved it quickly to the floor. In the third image of the DDS, the client is asked to draw a picture of how they're feeling using lines, shapes, and colors. This is the very first time that we see anything in the image filled in, the blue triangles. There's a rippled purple line dividing the page horizontally, and it has jagged teeth-like blue triangles that are pointing up. Oh, sorry about that, guys. Caroline called this her roller coaster of addiction, saying that it could also be her way out the jail door. But most importantly, she said that it could be her level of scaredness, very casually at the end of the standardized assessment. Caroline hesitated greatly when starting this image. She reviewed the rules in detail, asking multiple questions about the specifics of what was being asked of her. She was very meticulous in this drawing, spending most of her time here out of all of them in the series, for a total of about 2 to 3 minutes. She drew each triangle in a rhythmic motion in what appeared to be a self-soothing behavior. The first image in the DDS often shows us a glimpse into one's defenses. Caroline showed me a stereotypic image of a happy family with a home. The only people she let in were her mother and her boyfriends. Despite her barred surroundings and trauma intake, she told me that everything was picture perfect and okay. However, unresolved grief appeared particularly important, evidenced by the comparatively large size and placement of her children outside of the home. These children were also removed from her custody. This is further substantiated by her dislike of the roots, because they will eventually die in her second image, possibly speaking to the recent deaths in her family. The tree in the second image has been referred to as a self-symbol, and what we can see is the barren background is similar to her social situation, void of friends and lack of a desire to make them. The lack of detail echoes the defenses from her first image. Though the tree is in the shape of a keyhole, her house has no doorknob for anyone to get in or anything to come out. Additionally, the lack of detail in this image may parallel her sense of self and identity after being removed from her lifestyle of addiction and prostitution. Caroline's roller coaster of addiction perhaps goes hand in hand with what appears to be her difficulty in emotion regulation. This is evidenced by her startle response and the quickness in which she completed the assessment, finishing a 60-minute measure in less than 15 minutes. This is further seen in what she referred to as her level of scaredness. The steep crests and deep valleys are particularly turbulent, with the addition of spiky triangles on top. As you can see, Caroline's treatment goals were taken directly from her DDS assessment. Our first 2 goals were sobriety maintenance and increasing her sense of identity. Obviously, however, I needed a key for the door without a doorknob before I could come into her internal world. I met with Caroline over the period of 3 months, with a total of 6 sessions completed. These sessions were conducted while incarcerated and also upon release. In the beginning phase of treatment, Caroline was consistently exposed to expectations of change in the therapeutic milieu and the dynamics of power and control in the institution of her incarceration. In keeping with effective early addiction treatment strategies, I allowed Caroline to steer the content of therapy where she needed. She had the power to choose. Caroline did not make art during the first phase of treatment, with the exception of the DDS assessment. Similar to the roof and chimney in the image of a house, her talk held a steady extrusion of ruminating thoughts and emotions running through her head. Her incessant chatter felt more of a method to distance me than it was to let me in. The content of her speech consisted largely of interpersonal conflicts she was having in the dorm. Additionally, she perseverated on confusion about being in group addiction treatment. For the mere technicality that she had no drug-related charges on record, only prostitution. And therefore, she perceived that she was not an addict. The closer Caroline got to her out date, the more she spoke at length about her historic and future drug use. Caroline was required to write a reflection letter on her progress in order to receive higher level privileges in the institution of her incarceration. The content of this letter is strikingly similar to the visual evidence found within this image. The letter was idealized and heated overtones of sobriety rhetoric with a lack of focus on her process of change. She wasn't letting one inside, she wasn't letting anything out. just like the door without a doorknob shown in the image above. She was telling us through these documents that she was recovered simply so she could move on with her life as soon as possible. Furthermore, when she gave me this letter to read during her individual art therapy session, she stated everything in it was a lie. Caroline's substance use dialogues quickly evolved into ambivalence towards sobriety, and she perseverated on ways to break the rules without getting caught. Her ambivalence was not being addressed in any other areas of treatment because of this facade that she put on. She was taking a risk with these disclosures. She appeared to be testing our relationship. Would I be harsh and punitive like the criminal justice system, or would I be uninvolved like her mother? Similarly, I couldn't help but wonder if a parallel process was playing out with the art. How would I respond if she didn't do what she thought I expected of her? We explored her ambivalence, and I honored her choice not to make art. Caroline and I met a week after she was released, focusing on stability triggers and safer sex practices. However, Caroline did not return to therapy or mandated treatment for 5 weeks after this initial session. Her decompensation of motivation occurred during the winter holidays, a time when many in treatment experience increased difficulties. A warrant was placed for her arrest for failure to appear in court, and she was apprehended 14 days later. During this time, I relied heavily on response art. According to Franklin, response art is a meditative self-awareness practice that can enable the clinician to gain a witnessing consciousness about therapeutic ambiguity through the rich translation of symbols and metaphors after focusing on the feeling and the art. During the 7-week period, it helped manage the uncertainty of Caroline's safety and the ambiguity if I would ever see her again. It helped me maintain objectivity and allowed a feminist and Buddhist perspective to emerge. Caroline had the capacity to engage in the world in a manner that held brilliant strategies to survive. I then realized the trajectory of success in Caroline's life culturally may be very different from mine. I met Caroline the day after she was apprehended and focused on addiction, safety, and stability after relapse. She showed clear signs of withdrawal, though attributed it to being sick with a cold. She remained limp and still in her chair, head hung low with minimal speech. This was a vast difference from the energetic and fidgety demeanor she had always shown. Change was nowhere on her radar. Her focus was leaving the institution of her incarceration as soon as possible. Caroline, isolated in her dorm, was disinterested in making friends and slept throughout the day. Art was used as a means to check in during session, given her sullen, quiet, and withdrawn presentation. The intermediary of the art process, product, and materials created a sufficient buffer from the threat of intimacy, while at the same time bringing us closer together. Although she didn't trust her peers, Caroline observed my consistency in meeting with her in both in and out of incarceration, and her attachment to me started to grow. Caroline entered session vastly different than prior weeks, greeting me with bright eyes, wide smile, gestural body motions, and exuberance in her fast speech. She appeared her old self again. But one thing had changed. She expressed a gape. An attachment was felt from her that had not been present before. She was excited to be there, displaying behavioral and emotional cues that she was excited to see me. I'd never experienced Caroline engage in or express genuine heartfelt connection with another like that before. She engaged in reciprocal communication, was increasingly open to redirection with challenging material, and her concentration in art making and art communication vastly improved. With improvements in safety and stability, I decided to integrate expressing emotional and cognitive states and narrating thoughts, feelings, and behaviors associated with events as described in the trauma-informed structured art therapy protocols by Rankin and Tucker and Naff. Seen here is a graphic portrayal of her stage of change and triggers to use. The triangle on the left is using crack cocaine, and the circle on the right is her sobriety. Caroline used a square to accurately locate where she was in her desire to use, the middle, showing her ambivalence. She began to unravel her triggers and rewards of using by exploring the gap between her feelings of sadness and substance use, which is on the right between the figure and the triangle. Notably, she made a connection between her triggers to use and the guilt and shame she still currently held about using the moment that her husband died. Caroline was deliberate in both her drawing and explanations, slow and careful throughout. I praise Caroline for her hard work, an authentic source of external validation reflecting her accomplishments. Though validation was the one thing she desperately wanted from the courts, her lovers, and her mom, she eagerly dismissed it on her way out. Caroline was ordered to transfer to a 30-day addiction treatment center before resuming involvement in the prostitution diversion program. However, Caroline successfully petitioned the courts to be released into transitional housing until a bed became available in a detox center. Caroline did not report to housing upon release. Despite not following mandated orders, Caroline did appear for her first court review post-incarceration. She crafted a rosy narrative of herself with her family at home, similar to the image of a house and family. She was scheduled for a court review the following week, and a warrant was issued for her arrest for failure to appear. I haven't seen her since. Let's take another look at the research question before we draw some results. Informed by the need for social justice reform in the criminal justice system and institutions of incarceration, the study attempted to investigate the use of art therapy as a tool to demonstrate progress in treatment-resistant women involved in the criminal justice system. Given the impact of trauma on the verbalization of emotion and cognitive processes and art therapy's unique ability to bypass these deficits, it was hypothesized that art therapy would be an effective treatment approach to address cognitive and emotional patterns impacting recidivism in justice-involved women. With Caroline's abrupt termination from treatment, it's difficult to gauge how beneficial art therapy was for her. However, through reviewing the data collected from art therapy sessions, a few causal correlations can be made. Caroline became increasingly more transparent and congruent with me, which led to her ambivalence surfacing in sessions so it could be treated. As due to her defenses, it wasn't being treated anywhere else in any other part of the programming. Confirmation of the hypothesis was apparent in the areas of identifying substance abuse triggers, increasing focus while decreasing arousal, and an increased capacity for congruency and transparency. The use of image gave Caroline a conduit to communicate otherwise threatening emotional material in terms of her motivation towards sobriety. Due to art's natural capacity to engage the parasympathetic nervous system, subsequent relaxation responses allowed higher level cognitive processes to come online, such as the capacity for insight. Therefore, Caroline was able to increase her focus and expanding her awareness about her substance use. This adaptive response took the place of telling cyclical stories that exasperated her anxiety or premature trauma narratives. Additionally, Caroline demonstrated consistent growth in her attachment to me, despite distrusting her peers and staff throughout the involvement in programming. According to Balby and Vanderkolk, these therapeutic gains would not have been accomplished without feeling safety in relationship during threatening circumstances throughout her incarceration. I'm going to use this term very loosely. Although Caroline still has a warrant out for her arrest, she has not recidivated in over 4 months. This is her longest period out of incarceration or the criminal justice system out of any time since I've known her. This study raised many more questions than it did answers. For instance, should treatment be provided by agencies specializing in prostitution similar to eating disorder treatment? Are there methods to ensure adherence to treatment besides court involvement? Should these women be asked to fit within the 50-minute hour standardized and created by an educated, wealthy white man in power? And why are our women who are fighting to survive by selling their bodies convicted with criminal records instead of our Johns? The research into prostitution diversion programs is sparse, though one study found women with a history of childhood physical abuse and women with a history of drug and/or alcohol addiction were each twice as likely to be rearrested for prostitution, and women who had a prior prostitution charge were 5 times more likely to be rearrested for prostitution, according to Egan et al. These findings are not very promising, considering that statistically 75 to 90% of women engaged in prostitution have substance abuse histories, according to Alvarez and Rowan, Sipowicz, and Ward. Also, 81% of these women have histories of physical abuse, and 77% of these women have histories of sexual abuse. Caroline was one of these women. With a history of substance abuse, childhood victimization, and prior prostitution charges on record, the numbers tell us that it was highly unlikely that she was going to be released from the grip of this lifestyle in our time together. As I see it, until we can find effective solutions to helping these women change their lives, the blood is still in our hands. This is not to remove accountability from these women, nor their empowered choice. However, if we are going to provide treatment to justice-involved women engaged in prostitution, this treatment needs to be effective. With that, it warms my heart with excitement as I leave the education system with my training as an art therapist and embark on my lifelong education in the field, having the opportunity to fail again, and fail harder until I form a reflected body of data that I can reflect on to see what actually helps, to see what actually works. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. At this time, I'm going to open up the floor to my site supervisor, Dr. Paula Prentice.
Thank you all for having such a beautiful and amazing program that allowed us to meet Erin and to have her work with us in Denver. It was nice to have her here, and the impact that she made with Carolyn and the other people that we worked with was really astounding. She had a few people, several people who did poorly with it, who didn't want to come to their last session because they didn't want it to end. I think that says a lot about the beautiful work that she did, and the way that she helped people create attachments when they haven't had them before. And in the course of her internship, she was able to facilitate both group and individual treatment in mental health justice systems inside of an institution of incarceration as well as outside, with very limited budget and limited access to resources. We're a nonprofit, so we don't have a lot of money for buildings or extra offices for interns or extra confidentiality. So we have sound machines and we have our hearts and we have our creativity. And because of Erin, I've learned a lot about how to connect to people and how to take risks. And I've started making my own response art and doing that. That's something that I use so helpful. So I just wanted to say thank you again, and I know that when Carolyn comes back, she's going to feel more attached to us because of her.
Yeah. Thank you. At this time, I'll open the floor to the art therapy faculty to ask easier rather than harder questions. Just joking. Jessica.
I was curious about the first image in the DES. Just thinking about it developmentally, I was wondering if you had thoughts about that. You know, that's the main image that we've seen of hers here.
Right.
So I was curious about that and about if you have thoughts about